Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 119. On to the next chapter. When Izuku finally got back to the brewery after the sports festival, he was relieved and disappointed in equal measure to see that Eraser had texted him to cancel patrol. He had said that there was an emergency and that they shouldn't worry about it, but they worried anyway. Well, they worried as much as they could before falling asleep on the couch in their day clothes. When his alarm woke him up, he was thankful that the teachers had all cut back on homework assignments because Izuku had slept a full 12 hours, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. He hadn't even taken his backpack off fully, much less gone through it to get any homework he may or may not have had. He also hadn't eaten since noon yesterday, and the cold dinner he had intended to heat up last night was calling his name. He scarfed it down, paying little mind to how unpleasant the textures were at the temperatures they were at. After being ambushed by his classmates on the way out of the locker room yesterday, he was a little nervous to go back to school. He didn't want to be rude, but he also didn't want to talk about the sports festival. It was stressful enough to live through it once, and he didn't want to have to do it again. He hadn't been recognized on the way home last night with his hood up, but the only hoodies he had were his old Put Your Hands Up radio hoodie and his Ivy hoodie. He really didn't want to be bothered on the long train ride across the city, so Put Your Hands Up was his only real option. It had grown a little too small for him, or rather, he had grown too big for it over the years, but it still fit well enough and covered his relatively distinctive hair. He'd just have to take it off before he got to campus because if Mike saw him wearing this, he might actually die of embarrassment. He'd been wearing it to and from school only so far as the bounds of Uptown in an effort to hide his UA uniform and avoid attracting unwanted attention. So the ritual wouldn't change that much. He'd just have a much smaller window of time to hide the evidence. Thankfully, his skills of going unnoticed were well practiced. He made his way to school and shoved the hoodie to the bottom of his bag without being recognized. But he knew that wasn't going to last once he got on campus. He kept his head down and made his way to his little alcove in the disused hallway as quickly as he could. He got a few whoops and hollers, but no one actually stopped him to talk, so he'd count it as a win. He stayed hidden away for as long as he could, but eventually he had to make his way to the classroom. The room was disordered. People were out of their seats and chatting with friends. But once the first person noticed him, everyone noticed him. They all seemed excited. They all had smiles and some gestured wildly, but Izuku couldn't really make out what anyone was saying since they were all speaking at the same time. The one thing he could make out was Ida's notable silence. He was sat in his seat at the back of the room, and he didn't even look up at the commotion. He didn't try to quiet anyone down or demand order like he usually did. He just stared at his hands on the desk. Uraraka gave him a smile, but she also seemed pretty downtrodden. But fortunately and unfortunately, Izuku had timed his entrance impeccably, and the bell rang, forcing everyone to settle back into their seats less than half a minute after he walked in. Maybe he could catch them between classes and see what was going on. When Eraser walked in with a notable tension in his shoulders, Izuku started to become rather worried. What had happened? All three of them were upset, and Izuku had no clue why. His mind started running a mile a minute, but was stopped abruptly when Eraser announced that internship offers had been compiled. He started passing out papers full of lists to everyone who had participated in the sports festival, and Izuku's eyes went wide when Eraser dropped the packet stapled together onto his desk. There had to be at least 6 pages, double-sided, single-spaced, and all of them were offers for him? This had to be damn near every agency in Japan. He recognized a lot of these agencies. These were good agencies, but the need to pick something good for Limelight or Heroics, right? That would be in his best interest. But there were so many Twilight and even Underground heroes on their way. What was that? A dull thump hit the back of his chair. He whipped his head up, and several of his classmates were looking at him, as well as Eraser. He looked back at Shinso, who apparently had kicked the back of his chair, and he just pointedly moved his attention back up to Eraser. Oh, damn it. He was talking, and Izuku was probably mumbling inane bullshit again. As I was saying, internship choices are due by Wednesday. You should all have a list of offers as well as a form to fill out at the back with your final choice. That needs to be filled out and turned in to me, or you will not be getting any internships. No exceptions. Any questions? Eraser presumably continued speaking. Izuku did his best to fade out of existence as he felt his face burn with a blush. He bit his lip and looked back down at his packet as Eraser answered questions. The E section of his alphabetically ordered list caught his attention. 2 names in particular, Eraserhead and Endeavor? Why the hell did he get offers from either of them? He didn't exactly leave his conversation with Endeavor on good terms. In fact, he was under the impression that he would have liked to squish Izuku like a little bug. So why the hell did he get an internship offer from him? And what about Eraser? He didn't seem like the kind of guy to offer internships. Moreover, he didn't even have an agency. He worked with the police. And where the hell was he going to take an intern anyway? Uptown? He'd never done it before, so why would he be starting now? Is it because he had told him Ivy was leaving? Was he trying to replace them with him? He could at least ask Todoroki about Endeavor, but Eraser was... Well, Izuku had a feeling he wasn't going to find an explanation for that anywhere. His classmates' murmurings clued him into what was going on with Ida before he ever got the chance to ask. Ingenium had been hospitalized with severe injuries after another attack from the hero killer. With everything that had been going on in his life, he wasn't very up to date on current events. He knew who the hero killer was, but didn't know much about him. He should stop by the library or internet cafe and do some research on that. As for right now, Ida just looked like he wanted to be left alone. When lunch rolled around, he wasn't surprised to see Ida brush him and Uraraka off to go eat by himself. They didn't stop him, but it hurt to watch him suffer alone. Something that did surprise him, however, was Todoroki walking over to their table and asking to sit with them. Usually he sat by himself, or with some of the other quieter kids on the other side of the lunchroom. Yeah, of course you can, Uraraka answered before Izuku got the chance. He sat down next to Izuku and didn't do much to help with the conversation vacuum developing in Ida's absence. As the awkward silence stretched on, Izuku figured this was a good time as any to ask. Hey, Todoroki? He hummed in response around a mouthful of soba. I wanted to ask you about my, internship offers? He started sheepishly. Todoroki just looked at him, waiting for him to elaborate. It's just, I got one from Endeavor. He trailed off awkwardly, hoping that Todoroki would pick up on the non-question. He didn't want to explain why that was strange in front of Uraraka. Todoroki furrowed his brow for a moment before making an expression Izuku had yet to see from him. He smiled and huffed out a laugh. Something about the laugh of someone who never laughs was infectious. The same thing happened with Eraser. Whenever they managed to make him laugh, they couldn't help cracking up themselves. He didn't even know why Todoroki was laughing, but he found himself laughing too. Vernon probably sent out the internship offers. Todoroki answered, a small smile still on his face. Izuku laughed again at the explanation. It would be incredibly funny to see the look on Endeavor's face if he showed up for an internship with him. Given that Vernon likely sent the offer, he probably wouldn't be seeing much of Endeavor if he accepted it. But the thought was funny regardless. It's the highest offer I got. Maybe I should take it, Izuku joked as he got his giggles under control. That would be nice. We could intern together, Todoroki answered casually. Together? Was Todoroki interning with his father? Why would he do that? That was an awful idea. School was supposed to get him out of that house and as far away from that man as he could be, not straight back into the fire. You're interning with your dad? Izuku asked cautiously. Todoroki just hummed in confirmation. Don't you get enough of him at home? He asked in a joking tone, trying his best not to give anything away to Uraraka. If I want to get better control of my fire, he's the most logical choice. Todoroki offered nonchalant as ever. That made sense. He wondered if Todoroki had given any thought to his question about what he wanted. Did he want to be a hero? Whether he had made a decision on that or not, he was right. It was in his best interest to gain better control of his fire. As much as he hated to admit it, Endeavor was the best person to teach him that. Yeah, guess you're right, he acquiesced before turning back to his lunch. I didn't get a ton of offers, but I think I'm going to go for a hero that focuses on hand-to-hand combat. I just gotta look through the list and see who would be the best fit. I don't know half the names on here, Uraraka interjected. I could look through it. I don't know every hero, but I know a lot of them, Izuku offered. Oh, that would be great. You could at least point me in the general direction, right? She said with a smile. As she rummaged through her bag for the papers, Izuku realized how nice it was to have friends like this. He had been alone for so long now that he'd forgotten. He hoped that whatever happened at the parent-teacher meeting next week didn't ruin this. He wasn't sure he could bear to lose it all at once. Ida hardly said a word for the rest of the day, and the tension had yet to leave Eraser's shoulders. Uraraka seemed to just be feeling sympathy pains because she had perked up a bit when Ida had left during lunch. Did Eraser know Ingenium? They were around the same age, and he's pretty sure they both went to UA, so it wasn't impossible. Plus, Eraser had seemed nonplussed about Ida's theatrics since day one. If he still looked so tense on patrol tonight, maybe he could ask him. But as Izuku, it wouldn't exactly be appropriate to broach the topic. Ida walked with them to the train station like he always did, but he didn't say much of anything. He spoke when spoken to, but that was it. As he went to board his eastbound train, Izuku told him to text or call him if he needed anything, but the offer was just met with a stiff nod that told him it wasn't taken seriously. I'm guessing he hasn't talked to you about anything, Uraraka asked as Ida's train left. No, he confirmed. You heard what happened, right? Yeah, she responded, trailing off with a sigh. They didn't speak again until they boarded the train and traveled a few stops. I don't know him well, but I met him after the USJ. He came to pick up Ida and found out my parents wouldn't be able to make it into the city until the next day. So he offered for me to go home with them. He's very kind. He didn't deserve this, Uraraka said mournfully. Oh, he didn't know that she had ever met the elder Ida. Maybe she was feeling a little bit more than sympathy pains. No, I don't think many people deserve that. He's alive, though. Gotta look on the bright side, he offered weakly. Uraraka didn't respond to that. Not that there was really anything to say. It was a crap situation, and nothing was going to make it any less crappy except time. They bid their goodbyes and went their separate ways, but the filter of melancholy didn't lessen. Izuku had a feeling it wasn't going to lessen for a long, long time, but he did his best to ignore that. He'd gotten Eraser to agree to patrolling every night for the week before he left, and he should enjoy it while he could. As he and Hizashi were packing their things to leave, Shota got what being a teacher allowed him to dread all the way to the ripe age of 30. A call to report to the principal's office. Ooh, Sho's in trouble. Hizashi taunted him when the sound of the intercom was shut off with the click of Netsu putting the phone down. Shota just gave him a glare. He should have more empathy because Zashi wasn't going home without him anyway. Not if he knew what was good for him. Oh, quit it with the face. I'm gonna wait for you. You got any idea what this is about? They asked, returning their focus to packing up their bag. No clue. Nothing good, I imagine, he answered. Love the optimism, Sho. It's charming, they shot back. I'll text you if I think we'll be a while, he replied, ignoring the jab on his way out the door. When he got to Nedzu's office, he was surprised to find out that he wasn't the only occupant. Chio was sitting in one of the unreasonably plush chairs, and Shota had a feeling he was going to be bullied into helping her out of it before he left. Ah, Aizawa, please take a seat, Nedzu chirped, a touch too cheerfully. That tone was usually reserved for when he was in a particularly bad mood. Shota was not looking forward to learning what this meeting was about, but he took a seat anyway. Shuzenji, please continue, Nedzu prompted. Yes, I have some rather troubling wounds to report from one of your students. Shota had to fight the urge to groan. What the hell was wrong with this class? Could they not go a single day without threatening to give him a receding hairline? While I was tending to Midoriya-kun yesterday, of course, it was that one. Problem child. I noticed extensive scarring, mostly on his right side. It looked as though he had been burnt quite severely in the past, and there were also a number of gashes, all of which were fully healed, save the injuries he sustained in the festival. However, they were concerning enough to warrant a report, she concluded. Lovely. He didn't bother trying to hide how tired he was most of the time, and now was not an exception. He scrubbed a hand over his face and through his hair. Zashi had told him about the meeting they had planned with the boy's mother. He should probably be here for this, too. Mike's got a meeting planned with his mother at the end of the week. Should I call him in, or is that all there was to be said? Yes, All Might is involved with that as well, but I believe he left the grounds about 15 minutes ago. However, I don't believe there's anything more to be discussed for the time being, Nedzu answered. Well, thank God for little victories. He did not want to have this conversation with All Might. The man didn't even have a teaching degree, and he doubted he'd have the experience to deal with this properly. Well, he knew he didn't have the experience to deal with this properly. That's why Hizashi had been roped into this issue to begin with, because Yagi was out of his depth and Shoto was in and out of consciousness for several days. Shuzenji, you said that the scarring was quite old, yes? Netsu asked. Most of it. Lesser injuries looked newer. Nothing was fresh, though, or at least nothing that hasn't been documented, she confirmed. The two of them shared a look that seemed to communicate something that Shoto was not privy to. Did they know more than what they were letting on? There were too many unknowns surrounding Midoriya. He had his own slew of concerns, but for the sake of any potential connection the boy had with Ivy, he kept them to himself. He would talk to Midoriya tomorrow privately before he risked either sounding insane in front of his colleagues or genuinely endangering Ivy's cover. This was such a mess, and with Tensei in the hospital, it felt like the hits just wouldn't stop coming. He hardly ever felt well rested, but ever since this school year had started, he'd been running on fumes. He'd need to talk to Zashi about this. The wind against their face felt like home. Even though it had only been 2 days since they were last out, it felt like it had been weeks. The tension in Eraser's shoulders only seemed to have gotten worse since they'd last seen him. But they had all night to ask, so they let him relax with his dinner for now. Uptown had continued to be in good shape since the gang had been dealt with. It still had its unsavory characters, the streets were still neglected, and the buildings were still worn down. It was still the bad side of town, but it was much better than it had been. They never wanted to leave this city to its own devices, but they had to admit that Uptown had never been in better shape to be left unattended. Well, not completely unattended. Eraser would be in the streets keeping an eye on things, but he didn't have his finger on the pulse of the city like they did. They trusted him. They really did. But regardless of trust, it was difficult to release something they had sworn was going to have to be pried out of their cold, dead fingers. They had held this place so closely for so long, it's like their muscles had atrophied around the grip. As the night started to wind down and Eraser's tension had yet to lessen, they decided now was as good a time to ask as any. You've been tense all night. What's your problem? They asked as they made their way across a rooftop slowly, looking down at the few people left milling about the streets outside the bars. Work stuff. Don't worry about it. Eraser replied lazily. You've complained about work stuff before. You never looked like you needed several masseuses and a chiropractor to fix the kink in your shoulders. They shot back. Eraser studied their face critically for a moment before subtly shaking his head and responding, Work stuff's confidential. But I've got a friend in the hospital, which isn't helping. He admitted. Probably Ingenium. Just as they'd suspected. Small world. They still had no clue how to comfort him. And what about work was confidential? Did they get more information on the League? Was there another breach? Everything had seemed fine when he left school today, and he'd checked the news at the library. Well, if it was confidential, it wouldn't be on the news, would it? They gonna be all right? They asked cautiously, pushing their selfish curiosity down. Yes and no. He'll live, he answered. But not without consequences? No, not without consequences. If Ingenium couldn't continue his work as a hero, they could understand why that would weigh heavily on Ida. He always spoke so highly of him. Well, he's still alive. Be grateful for that. I'm sure he's struggling with what went wrong enough on his own. Focus on what went right for him. Eraser looked over at him and let a soft smile grace his features for a moment. Not bad advice, kid. Did you expect me to give bad advice? I'm hurt. They shot back with faux indignance in an attempt to lighten the mood. As was to be expected, Eraser just rolled his eyes at them. It's about time to walk the ladies home. Let's start heading that way, he said, dismissing the conversation. Right. Enough touchy-feely stuff for Eraser. Noted. The group was small tonight. Only Iwai and Sakura, and Ivy was secretly glad for it. Those two had been here the longest. They were closer with him than the rest of the ladies, who seemed to cycle in and out of the scene more often than these two. He was going to miss them the most, so it was nice to spend time with them while he could. Sakura had recently gotten a nicer place closer to the bar area, so they dropped her off first, before bringing Iwai back to the place she'd lived in for as long as they could remember, a condo on the far south side nearer to the warehouse district. The night was pleasant, and the company was even nicer. They should have known it wouldn't last. They were walking past a stretch of empty lots when it happened. Of course, it had to be a stretch of empty lots. Nowhere to hide. A man on the other side of the street started shouting at them, calling for Iwai. Iwai, you whore! Well, you think you could just drop me like that? I told you you'd regret it. The man was clearly inebriated as he walked toward them. Thankfully, the streets were deserted because he did not check for traffic as he stepped onto the road. Eraser pushed Iwai behind him as the man began to approach, and that seemed to have been the wrong move. Who the hell is he? You can't go a day without getting someone else's belly wet, can you? He was only halfway across the far lane of the road when he pulled a gun. He was well out of range for Eraser's capture scarf, and they were well within range for a pistol. It felt as if time stopped as the muzzle flash went off and they heard the bullet tink against the chain-link fence behind them. They moved before they could even think of anything beyond the image of Eraser and Iwai lying on the ground, their blood seeping into the cracks of the concrete and the light leaving their eyes. They were across the street in the blink of an eye and a flash of green sparks that shone brightly under the low light of the waning crescent moon and dingy street lamps. The man was disarmed and knocked out before they even realized what they'd done. As they stood over the man who lay unconscious on the ground, they felt paralyzing horror seep into their bones. There was no way Eraser didn't see that. His hands shook around his grip on the gun, and the silence of the night felt like it stretched on for an eternity. His back was turned to Iwai and Eraser, and he couldn't force himself to turn around. He didn't want to turn around. He didn't want to see the mess he'd made of things. He could hear Iwai's shaky, tearful breaths, and he could hear hesitant footsteps approaching him. But still, he couldn't move. He hadn't breathed since he'd realized what he'd done. How long had he been standing here? He needed to breathe. He knew he needed to breathe. But his body wouldn't obey his commands. He could hear his blood thrumming in his eardrums, and his hair stood on end so violently that it felt like someone was pulling on it. Fear had never gripped him so thoroughly. A thought idly passed through the panic. At least it couldn't get any worse. Or he figured that would be the case up until he heard Eraser speak. Midoriya? End of chapter.